I remember in the rooted community that we had a discussion going about independent reading. And the person who posed the question was concerned that when their child was engaged in independent reading, that she knew that it wasn't accurate reading, that they had a tendency to possibly be using less than desirable skills, right? While reading independently, and what to do about that. And then it raised a question about, independent reading, how important is independent reading? What do we think about it? Should it be a part of everyone's day, right? So if you don't have a struggling reader, it's an easy answer. Have time in the day for independent reading, whether it's because they're reading their history, or it's because they have their own novel that they get to read, or because it's a novel that you've assigned or something. Independent reading is easy when you don't have it, when the child doesn't struggle with reading. When they struggle with reading, independent reading becomes more difficult. The preference is that they're always reading to a level where they can be 95 to 98% successful. It's interesting. I just happened to be doing some continuing ed, and they literally just gave that statistic about being 95 to 98% successful. And by successful, we mean accurate and comprehending. So they're reading accurately and they're comprehending. So children who tend to read more laboriously also, I find, are more likely, if they're reading on their own, to actually use the good skills, but they tire out really quickly. So for them, they tend to prefer reading text that's easier, that's definitely below their current working level, so that they can be successful and not so exhausted when they're reading on their own. So if, working level is, we're working on different long vowel sounds, and you can read 2 and 3 syllable words when we work on it, then they can read an easier reader that doesn't have very many long vowel sounds and not as many multi-syllable words, and be pretty successful and hit that 95 to 98% mark. But they'll tire out, and they may only get a few pages read, if you're lucky, during that time, because they might be slow readers. Slow in pace, So again, that's a little easier. Now I find extra readers for them to do on their own. I always make sure that before they start reading, we do some read aloud practice to get them started and remind them of their good skills. And now I want you to go read this on your own. What's difficult is when you have a child who's a pretty fluent reader, they're pretty fast, but their accuracy is poor. And those kids tend to, they're with you and working at a working level because their spelling's not keeping up, their reading accuracy isn't good, their comprehension may or may not be influenced by all this, and it might be creating more difficulty in their writing. But reading wise, they zoom ahead, they think they're doing great, they have no idea how inaccurate they are, and they get the gist of the story, and they want to read books at possibly even grade level. Those kids are more difficult. I don't think we can stop them. And one might wonder if we should, but they definitely are practicing bad skills when they read on their own. There's just no doubt about it. They are. And if they love to read and they want to read on their own, I don't think there's a whole lot we can do about it, except, again, say, okay, but we're going to read part of this book aloud you reading aloud to me, so that you have to use your good skills, and we use good practice when you're reading this book. And that's kind of the best I can get out of that situation. So I think we have, and then we kind of have kids who are in between that, right? You definitely always want the independent level to be very successful. So you want to be choosing books, if you can, that allow for that. Sometimes that might mean that kids who don't have a lot of stamina, that they read a lot of short pieces, like books that have like little facts, or jokes, or different. Sometimes the graphic novels can be easier because there's a lot of white space, and it gives them opportunity independently to read books that feel easier, books that are very formulaic. So I already know the character. They go through the same basic plot every single time. It's my comprehension is definitely eased by these outside factors of it being simple and formulaic, and I can work on, just like independently applying my skills. The independent reading question is tricky. Our goal certainly is that kids will have some independent reading time, but we can't always just assign it. And you really, I'm always saying, what is your goal? So if your goal is that they use good skills, then independent reading may or may not get you there. Now, something that I will do is I may do something like, we're going to do a copywork passage from this piece here that I know you can read. I want you to read it independently first, and I'll be there in a minute, and then we'll read it out loud together. So I've kind of like, for kids who don't like to read independently, I've kind of incorporated an independent aspect in, and they know that they're going to reread it to me. So they have a tendency to do a little better job, hopefully. And I also know we're going to get to the work of it if we need to, if they weren't accurate. Sometimes when that happens, we'll come upon a word that the student didn't know, and they had trouble decoding it. And then when they're with me, they kind of like it's obvious that the first pass through, they didn't get the word. And I'll say, so what did you do when you came to this word when you were by yourself? And they'll say, well, I just didn't know. I skipped it. I just guessed it was this. They give that answer. And then we kind of talk about, well, if you were reading independently and you come upon a word you don't know, what could we do instead? Skipping, guessing, that's not reading. Skipping and guessing is not reading. Really working through the word, asking for help. Sometimes we truly do not know how to pronounce a word. I mean, how many of you have been reading on a Kindle? You truly don't know how to pronounce a word. And, you want to hear it. You want to hear it pronounced because you're not sure. That happens. Not that I want kids just sitting there saying, hey, Siri, hey, Google, what is this word? And they spell it or whatever. I mean, I don't want that, but getting some help and getting some information can still be a resource, and maybe they need a little work with that. So tricky, this independent reading thing. It is a goal. Just because it's a goal doesn't mean it's a goal for today. It might be a goal for tomorrow. And like I said, if you have kids you really want to read on their own, it's pretty hard to stop them, and it's pretty unsettling to try to do it anyway. So, I think you got to let them. Interested anyone who's here, if independent reading is a part of your day, and how is that going for you or your student?
I've had to model like the whole concept of, reading a word and having no clue what it means. And, even my teenagers, they do it and then they just skip it. And I'm like, well, how do you even know what that is? I don't know what it is. How do you know what it is? Like, and so, there was a time when they were a little younger where I like required that they circle at least 5 words,
Ah, that's a good idea.
and look them up,
Mhm,
to show that they were paying attention to the words that they did or didn't know.
mhm. Yeah, we did that too, actually. Everyone had to kind of come up with 3 in the course of a week that either they didn't know or they were interested in, because sometimes, you don't happen upon one you don't know. Or they were interested in, and it was an interesting way to help them pay more attention to what they didn't know. But also, I have to say, if they don't know too many words, they're going to skip more. Like, so that's why that 95 to 98% ability level has to be there. If it's too hard, now I have no choice. I'm just going to guess my way through. And you kind of can have kids who are in this get it done mode. They're not comprehending. They're not using best skills. They're just, you told them to sit there for 20 minutes and they're sitting there for 20 minutes. And or the goal was to read 2 pages and I got it done. It's done. Can't tell you anything about it. And that's not what we want anyway. That's not what reading is. So we certainly, um, again, always ask yourself, what is the goal? Someone wrote, can't stop one of mine. Someone else wrote, my son loves audiobooks and I've gotten the Kindle books for some that are linked to the text. So the text highlights the words as they're spoken. I like that too. I don't mind that. I have wondered if there is a downside to this for the struggling reader or not. I think the only downside when a student is reading along with an audiobook is it all depends on their reading rate. So if their reading speed can't keep up with the audiobook, I mean, some kids are very, you know, laborious as they read. It's difficult and they're not fast. And so they just get to a point where they'll just stop reading along because they just can't. They've lost their way. Um, and just because it's in front of them being highlighted doesn't mean they're reading along. But I also think when the pace is good for them, it can teach them a lot about phrasing and intonation. It can teach them really what good readers do when they read. They don't just speed along. They actually have pausing. And so all of that can be good for them if the speed is manageable.